And what are the last chapter 13, doing in the Epistle to the Hebrews? Welcome to another tidbit from the Bible. I'm Dr. Paul Petersen. We're studying Hebrews, and we have reached chapter 13. And when a modern reader arrives at this last chapter, he may or she may feel this is a little different, isn't it? After the intricate and very profound and literally well-formulated reflections and thoughts and appeals, exhortations, etc. in the preceding 12 chapters, this chapter sounds more like a little mix of different kinds of small appeals and exhortations scattered with some theological references, and then a final greeting. This has got some people to say another person wrote it. Maybe Paul put it in to a sermon that was preached by someone else. Who knows? Now, here's the secret. The students of ancient or antique rhetoric has observed how it was common and not only accepted, expected by a preacher or someone who had given a speech that in the end he would close it with a number of short appeals to the readers, where in such short appeals he would highlight some of the issues that he had spoken about in the previous, trying to exhort them, appeal to their emotions and their passions. Such a closure would be called a peroratio. The introduction, the first 4 verses in Hebrews, these well-structured, well-formulated, profound statements are called together an exordium. And this nice little word, peroratio, fits chapter 13 in Hebrews very, very well. So from the point of a perspective of ancient rhetoric, this chapter fits exactly as it should in the context of the era, the time period where it was written. So who wrote it? And I have to admit, I don't know. There is an ongoing discussion, and early tradition points to Paul as the author, and there are a lot of arguments in favor, and there are strong arguments against it, and scholars are divided. I'm not certain I know the answer. I'm not certain it is that important to me either, because the mighty message and the way it is presented in Hebrews inspires me, even though I don't know who the author is. I don't mind calling it Paul. I'll have to ask him one day. But sometimes you hear strange arguments. Here's a funny one I saw on the internet not long ago. The argument goes like this. In the ordinary letters of Paul that we know from Scripture, he always begins with saying who he is and sends his greeting. By the way, this is what he did because that was a common way of doing it in the ancient culture. Now, in this particular epistle to the Hebrews, this doesn't happen. And when you come to the end, it is obvious that the reader writes to somebody, or the author writes to somebody, some readers, who seem to be aware of his identity. But it is not explicitly stated. And here the argument was as follows: because it is not explicitly stated that it is Paul, it cannot be him. Now, think through the consequence of that argument. If it cannot be Paul because it is not explicitly stated, the epistle is not written at all because no author is explicitly named. But we do have the epistle. And by the way, we call it epistle, but the whole point is here, it is not an ordinary epistle. This is a sermon, this is a speech. And let's then turn to chapter 13. How is this last chapter structured? And you can look at it this way. The first 6 verses belong together. These are exhortations to live faithfully, in gratitude, in the family of God. If you go back to chapter 12 from verse 4 and onwards, you will see this theme of being in God's family highlighted. This is what you have here with some very practical exhortations or appeals to the members of the church. Brotherly love, hospitality, marriage. These are strong exhortations speaking directly to practical areas of daily life as a family of God. Then from verse 7 to 16, you have a section that in particular deals with the Christian's relationship to leaders. It is framed by reference to their leaders in verse 7, remember your leaders. And in 17, this section is closed by obey your leaders. In this section, and this is of course very practical to how you relate to your leaders in the church, but in this section, of course, the movement is quickly from the earthly leaders to the grand heavenly leader, to Jesus Christ, who is, according to verse 8, the same yesterday and today and forever. And then you have a couple of references to his function as high priest and as sacrifice, the two main aspects of his work in the heavenly sanctuary. A reference to what he's doing and a reference to what he did on the cross, the blood that he is taking into the sanctuary for us to follow him and receive salvation and forgiveness. It is interesting, by the way, that this section also is framed in relation to the close of chapter 12. In the close of chapter 12, there is appeal in verse 28 to worship God acceptably. This is a Greek adverb, arestos. The equivalent verb is used in the final sentence of chapter 13, verse 16, where it is said, God is pleased. That is from eurarasteo. So, also here, like in the main body of the Epistle to the Hebrews, the letter is literally well structured, and here you have a couple of the typical frames that are used throughout the epistle. Now, the last section from verse 17 and onwards then is a closure with an appeal to prayer, with a blessing, personal greetings, typically for probably would have been added or written in connection with the spread of this sermon as it was brought to the readers many places in the early Christian church. So let me conclude by reading again the summary in Hebrews 13 of the whole message of the book. It is found in one particular sentence, and we have already read it. Verse 8, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. This is a very well-known saying. In the context of Hebrews, this saying is referring to the way that Hebrews throughout have referred to these time aspects of the past, the present, and the future. Note, for instance, the definition of faith in verse 1 in chapter 11. Faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. So faith is here connected to the future. The object is what we hope for. It is also connected to the present, that which we do not see, which in the context is a clear reference to the ministry of Jesus as our high priest in heaven. We do not see him except in faith, but we turn the eyes of faith towards him. So here in the definition of faith, you have the future, you have the present, but as you read through this great chapter of faith, you also realize that this faith is based on what God has already said and done. He has spoken in his Son, he has spoken through the blood of Christ, and that is what the faith is grounded on. The past deed of God for our salvation. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, referring to what he has done. Today, referring to what he is doing now. And tomorrow, referring to what he has promised he will complete for us as he returns. Thank you for listening to these tidbits from the Epistle to Hebrews. I hope you have learned something. I have learned a lot. And welcome back as we continue with the study on Genesis. That is for the next quarter. We will have some tidbits there as well. Thank you.